Okay, so hey, Ivy Psych. So today we're going to be going over kind of like the first kind of subunits. So the first thing that we're going to look at is techniques. So for techniques, this is a biopsych SRQ level. So for techniques, we are going to be looking at probably using the one that's going to be the study that's going to be the most convenient for us to remember. So we're going to go for McGuire's taxi driver study. Uh, Most likely question is explain a technique used to study the brain. And so for the AO1, we're going to be talking about the MRI. So let's kind of break down the MRI into pieces, okay? The MRI AO1 starts with, an introductory sentence. There are various techniques psychologists use to study the brain, blah, blah, blah. Then we say MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging, okay? It's important that we do that, then abbreviate MRI next to it, okay? So, things that we need to mention in an MRI AO1. Patient is lying in a tube-shaped machine. Okay, that's really important, as you can talk about it as a point for critical thinking, especially if it's a study with children, or I guess it could be said for adults too. When bringing up ethics and things, you can say that protection from harm, being in an MRI scanner for a long period of time can be kind of stressful on a person, especially if they have claustrophobia. So that's kind of a point that you can kind of discuss. But in the AO1, alongside the tube side machine, you also have to talk about how the image is developed. Okay, so you talk about how the magnets and radio waves measure the hydrogen nuclei in the brain. Okay, this is super important key point, as then you can develop to say creates a clear 3D image of the brain. Okay, then in the next part, you're going to be talk about kind of why this technique is used. So you talk about how, first of all, a really important point to hit is that you have to say it investigates brain structure, as when talking about McGuire and not saying that it investigates brain structure, it's going to be difficult to kind of plead your case. So you're going to talk about brain structure, you're going to talk about how it can show nerve injury. So these are kind of the more medical points. It's nerve injury, damage from stroke, and bleeding. Those are the three mains I would use. And then this technique is used to investigate brain structure changes due to learning or environmental stimuli. So this is an important part to hit on, okay? Because the whole point of McGuire's study is to show that with learning and environmental stimulus, the brain was able to develop more gray matter in the posterior hippocampus. So this is a really important part to hit on, okay? So AO2, I think, is pretty simple. So we all know McGuire's taxi driver. Since it's SRQ, we do have to go a little more in depth, and we are going to have to say right-handed London taxi drivers. And to remember kind of the amount of participants, just think 16 and 60. So 16 is the amount of people who are the healthy right-handed London taxi drivers. And remember, they had to have had 6 months more or 6 months or more of experience in order to be participate within the study as a subject. So also an important thing to remember is the study is trying to look for a correlation, which is super important. Remember, that's one of the research methods, is correlational study. It's looking for a correlation between spatial navigation and its impact on the brains of taxi drivers. So we need to really remember that and have that as the kind of the opening line of our AO2. So we have to talk about how there's 60 right-handed healthy non-taxi drivers, controlled, also men, who took in an MRI scan, okay? So, since the findings is going to be your bigger part of your AO2, you're going to talk about how that the taxi drivers had significantly more gray matter volume in areas linked to spatial navigation. So the areas linked to spatial navigation is the posterior hippocampus, and that is an important mark to hit, okay? We also need to talk about how the study showed the longer the participants had been a taxi driver, the more volume they had in their posterior hippocampus. Still, remember, that's got to be something that we hit to get that mark scheme. Then McGuire concluded that exposure, environmental stimulus, and learning, such as memorizing the routes and the streets of London, increased their need to their need to grow in the area of the brain that's in charge of the spatial navigation. So kind of going through the process of, and we'll talk about it later, neurogenesis of creating or no sorry I went on a wrong path there, but that's kind of how we end our AO2 there, on that it altered their brain structure, okay? And for the link, we're going to keep it super simple. This study shows how MRIs are used as a technique to study structural changes in the brain due to learning, in this case specifically navigational skills. So now that we know that, then that's our techniques, SRQ, done. You can feel really good about that, guys. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is localization. So again, for localization, we are going to be hitting hard with the McGuire again, okay? So it's going to be a very similar AO2, but we're going to have to change some things, okay? So let's think for AO1, okay? The theory of localization of brain function states that different parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of human functioning, okay? And remember, we looked at Broca and Wernicke, okay? And how they looked at how language is lateralized in the brain, yeah? So let's remember that. So for in this first part of the AO1, after we've said that it's responsible for different aspects of human functioning, we give two examples. We give behaviors and language, okay? Because that's going to be important for us to kind of go into the into the AO2. But then for the second half of the AO1, sorry, we go psychologists investigating localization use brain imaging techniques to investigate the correlations between brain processes and structures in human behavior. This is a super important part to look at, because it's kind of using some of that AO1 from techniques of, they use the brain imaging techniques to investigate the correlations, okay? Because what they want, what the IB markers want to see is that you understand that that the study is showing that because all these taxi drivers they all have the same brain processes of spatial navigation is super important, that's going to show, and that's going to show that the spatial navigation is localized to the posterior hippocampus. So it's a really important mark to hit there, okay? And so the kind of use brain imaging techniques, as I said, to investigate the correlations between brain processes and structures in human behavior, okay? So that's our AO1, guys. AO1 done, let's go. So the next thing I want to talk about is the AO2. So the AO2 is very similar to the last one, but we are really going to hone in on the brain structure part of it, because that's what localization is. So we say research into functions such as spatial navigation have supported the theory of localization. Remember, it's a theory of localization. We've got to mention that in our AO2 as well. So we talk about McGuire. We say the 16 and 60 again of the groups. Remember that from the techniques AO2. And then we are going to talk about, again, findings show an increased gray matter in the posterior hippocampus. And then this is up to you, but I think it's important to put in brackets there that the posterior hippocampus is assumed to be the part of the brain that's in charge of the spatial navigation, or is the part that's part of the spatial navigation. And so so when you do your last part of your AO2, which is McGuire concluded that the prolonged exposure to London city streets and memorizing routes increases the taxi driver's grey matter and altered their brain structure in the localized area of the posterior hippocampus. So let's remember this part for this last part of the AO2, okay? So for the link, this one's going to be a bit longer, but this shows how spatial and navigation skills are localized within certain regions of the hippocampus. Through focused, prolonged exposure, really important keyword, prolonged exposure of the streets, because they had to do that for 6 months at least, the taxi driver's grey matter increased due to neurogenesis. Keyword, guys, neurogenesis, the formation of neurons. In conclusion, the more the taxi drivers use spatial navigation, the more dense their neural network became, because remember in that AO2 that the people who had been doing it for longer, the taxi drivers who had been doing it for longer, had more gray matter in the posterior hippocampus than others. So that further shows the theory of localization of brain function, yeah? Do we get that? Okay. We're going to go into the last part of this little podcast episode where we talk about neuroplasticity. So again, we are going to be using McGuire here, okay? So, for this one, it's again pretty similar to localization in the AO2, but let's talk about the AO1 first, okay? So AO1 is neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change or reorganize in response to new learning, environmental stimuli, or loss of function, okay? So when the stimulus is, and remember to use the keyword novel, and in brackets and new, it kind of adapts and it forms new neurons, and then we have to hit the key mark of saying a process known as neurogenesis, okay? And we also have to say that the older you get, the slower the process of neurogenesis as well. We need to remember that in the A1. But otherwise, that A1 is quite simple. And yeah, okay. So we again, AO2, we talk about McGuire. We know McGuire, okay? But we talk about how it's the AO2 is for the more kind of the same as the one for localization, and again we need to make sure that we remember the posterior hippocampus, as it's quite important. I mean, it's not as important as localization, as that one's more about localization of brain function, but we need to make sure that we mention it. So we explain that the gray matter, so there was altered your brain altered in the face of new environmental stimulus. That's important. So for the link, I think a simple one to go with is this study supports the notion of neuroplasticity because it does, remember, as the taxi driver's brain structurally changes in response to learning and interacting with spatial navigation. So this is super, super important to remember, because this is basically your whole SRQ rides on it for this, that you need to be able to say, oh yes, it supports, and why. Okay? And also, extra point on the link is, the greater the structural differences, the more skilled the drivers with this cognitive skill. Just adds an extra element to this link that's going to just further it to become around 8 or a 9, hopefully, on the SRQ marks. But let's just remember, for all three of these, remember McGuire. Don't slack on it and think you remember it, because you might not actually remember all the facts of it, okay? So I want to thank you guys for listening to my first episode.